Now we will discuss about the passive movements of the lower limb. You know that in the lower limb there is hip joint, knee joint and ankle joint. First we will see the movements of the hip joint. In the hip joint there is flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, external rotation and circumduction. Okay. The passive movements of the hip we are doing in the lying position, supine lying, except the extension of the hip which we are doing in the side lying position as we did in the shoulder extension. Okay. So for starting the hip joint movement, we are just holding the heel of the patient and see it is supported, hold the foot and keeping my one hand below the knee joint. And please note the movements of my hand when I am flexing. See, it's from here it's coming up. Okay, this is flexion of the hip and knee joint. So, okay, hip flexion and knee joint we are doing in the same movement. Okay, if we don't keep the hands, if we don't take the hands while flexing, it will be impinged here. Okay, we will not get the full movement. So we need to, while moving, we need to take the hands. See the movements, it should be like from here to here. Okay, just to give support. Okay, I'm doing it on a model. If it's zero muscle power, then it will be flabby like this, heavy and flabby. So knee will go into hyperextension and it will damage the ligaments and muscles. So that we are just keeping holding our hand on the popliteal fossa and see the movements. And hip and knee flexion we are doing together. Okay, this is the movement, passive movement for hip and knee flexion. See, just see my hand movement. Okay, when coming down, my hands are coming down to support the joint, and when going up, it's going up to support the knee. This is the passive movement of hip and knee. We are doing it in a slow and rhythmical movement. Now we will go on to abduction and adduction of the hip. This is abduction, this is neutral position and this is adduction. Okay, abduction, neutral position and adduction. This is in the long liver position. Okay, neutral and adduction, abduction, neutral and adduction. Now we will do the internal and external rotation. We are holding just above the ankle and just above the knee joint and doing the internal rotation and external rotation. Internal rotation and external rotation. We are rotating the leg completely outward and inward. This is internal rotation and external rotation. Internal rotation and external rotation. Now we will combine all the movements and we will do the circumduction of the hip joint. We are just drawing a round with the knee joint. See, this is called circumduction of the hip joint. Okay, and when you are keeping it down, you should keep your hand again down. Okay, this is circumduction. This is the combination of all the movements of the hip. This is circumduction. And now we will keep the patient on side lying and do the extension of the hip. See, I am holding his leg on my forearm and supporting the knee and hip and doing the extension of the knee. See, I am using my body weight while doing it. Okay. So, extension of the hip joint. Now, we discussed all the movements of the hip and knee flexion. Okay, so we will keep the patient again straight. You remember that we did hip flexion the same way, hip and knee flexion and knee extension. Okay, hip extension we did it in the side lying position. This is a combined movement of hip flexion, knee flexion and knee extension. For that I am holding the feet heel. My hand is holding the heel and patient's foot is resting on my forearm, and I am keeping my one hand on the popliteal fossa and bending the knee, and while bending I am keeping my hand up and doing the hip flexion, knee flexion, and while extending the knee and hip I am keeping my hand down again to support. If I don't keep it here, this we are doing for the patients, their muscle strength is 0, 1, 2. So it will go for hyperextension and damage the ligaments and muscles, and later on when the patient recovers, he will have the problems in his knees. Okay. So in the knee movement, flexion and extension is incorporated in this movement. Now we will discuss about the passive movements of the angle joint. In the angle joint, in the angle, we will do 4 movements: dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion and eversion. This dorsiflexion and plantar flexion is done by angle joint, and inversion and eversion is done by subtalar joint. See, I am holding the same hold and his foot is rested on my forearm, and see, this is dorsiflexion, and see the movements of my grasped hand. So I am keeping it backward, so his foot goes in plantar flexion. This is dorsiflexion, this is plantar flexion, and if I keep my hand inwards, this is inversion, this is eversion. Okay, inversion, eversion. See, dorsiflexion, upwards I am keeping, and see my hand goes and I am pushing the heel back so that his foot comes forward, and this is plantar flexion, and I am keeping my hand inwards, this is inversion, and I am keeping my hand upwards with his foot, so it goes into eversion. Okay, this is inversion and this is eversion. So we have completed all the movements of the lower limb: hip flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, external rotation and circumduction, knee flexion, extension, and foot dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion and eversion. And now we have the toes. Okay, in the toes we will do all the movements. Okay, metatarsophalangeal joint, flexion, extension, and interphalangeal joints, flexion, extension. You can do it individually or in a group as possible. Okay, this passive movement of ankle and foot is very important, because many of the patients after hemiplegia or paraplegia, his legs will be in foot drop. Okay, so foot drop means there will be contracture of tendo-Achilles. The muscles gastrocnemius and soleus inserts here through the tendo-Achilles. So the tendo-Achilles will be shortened and it will lead to the foot drop. And if we don't stretch, the contracture will be permanent you will not be able to move later on. So that's the importance of passive movements.